Welcome everyone to the webinar of Powell Butte bird surveys of the past few years. The speaker tonight is Tom Verzi. I'm going to let Tom introduce himself in just a second, but just to let you know that this webinar is all about the results of a community science program that's been going on for 3 years, and also some scientific studies that Tom has been performing, all to look at populations of prairie nesting birds at Powell Butte. And Powell Butte, of course, is the largest prairie nesting bird habitat in East Portland. My name's Daniel Newberry. I'm the Executive Director of Johnson Creek Watershed Council. And with us, we have Gwyn Case, who is also on the staff at the Watershed Council. Gwyn is the AmeriCorps volunteer. We also have Marissa Ekman. Marissa is our community outreach coordinator, and you will be, if you join our surveys, you will be working with Marissa on scheduling and such. So Tom, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and we will go from there. But before you start your presentation, I want to do a little survey. So, but let's start with having you introduce yourself. And you are muted. Okay.
I am the executive director of a local nonprofit called Conservation Insight. I'll tell you a little bit more about the organization in a couple of my first slides when we get into the presentation. My background is in avian ecology. I'm a research ecologist as well as the executive director. I have my PhD in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University, and I've worked on a lot of different bird species over the years. One of my big projects, or a lot of my work, has been done in South Florida. As any of you that know me have probably heard about my work with grassland birds down there. So I have a lot of experience with grassland birds. And the largest project I've been working on throughout my career has been with the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, which is an endangered sparrow in the Florida Everglades. And it's interesting to know just a little bit about my background, because this project at Powell Butte is sort of a small scale version of this large scale project that I work on down in the Florida Everglades. If you're not familiar with what's going on down there, you should read about it. It's one of the largest restoration projects in the world to try and get the water flow back to the proper historic water flows in South Florida. And the Cape Sable seaside sparrow is an indicator species in that system. So we work very closely with federal agencies, giving them information on this sparrow so it can help direct their restoration efforts. And we are going to talk a lot more about that here in my presentation with what's going on in Powell Butte. So thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Tom. Before we get started, let's see who we have on the call today. So I've got a poll, and the poll has 2 questions. You should see the poll on the screen. And we're, I guess not quite yet, but those of you who are participants should see the poll. There are 2 questions just to kind of find out who the audience is today, which will help Tom as he gives his talk. He'll know, whether to talk in generalities or get into the real nerd stuff. But here we go. Let's say another 20 seconds or so. Get everybody to participate. It looks like we have over 60% of the people have participated, and 80%, almost everybody's participated. Come on, 85%. We're getting close. Okay, well, let's look at the results. So Rebecca is not seeing the poll. Not sure why, but we've got 90% people participated. So the poll, first question, have you been a surveyor with this program in 2019, 2020, or 2021? And 32% of the people said yes, 68% of the people said no. Okay, good. 1 out of every 3 people on the webinar has been one of our surveyors. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to the other 2/3. We look forward to telling you more and maybe pulling you in as surveyors in 2022. So the question number 2, what is your level of birding interest? 32% of the people said, I love birds, but don't do much birding. 11% said, I like to bird and know up to 50% of the birds in this area. 53% said, I know most of the local birds by sight or sound. 5% said, I know the difference between a second year and third year subadult herring gull. Okay, good to hear we've got some of those folks too. And then of course, 0% of the people said, I know more about Larry Bird than I do about winged birds. I'm glad we have 0% answering that. So that's the poll. Once again, you can see the results up here. And we're ready to get going. Tom, if you want to go, you should be able to share the screen and take it from here.
Okay. Should be coming up in a second.
And please note that Gwen said she's monitoring questions and we'll wait till Tom's finished before taking the questions.
Okay, can everybody see this screen? Okay, so let's get it started. All right, so I already introduced myself. This is a nice shot of one of the nice prairies up at Powell Butte with our state flower, Oregon sunshine, in full bloom from last spring. We're going to jump right into, let me tell you a little bit about Conservation Insight, because many of you probably don't know a lot about the organization unless you've heard me speak before, because you've signed up through the surveys with our partner, Johnson Creek Watershed Council. But I want you to know a little bit about our organization and what we do and our involvement in this particular project. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit based out of Happy Valley, Oregon, and we focus on doing avian research. We work throughout the country. We do work here in Oregon. We've done work in other states, and we're still doing some work down in South Florida. I founded the organization back in 2017. I was formerly with Rutgers University after getting my PhD. I stayed on there as a research scientist, and then I went with another nonprofit, and I wanted to get a little more control over how I used our funding. We're funded largely with government grants on most of our projects, federal and state grants. And one of the things that I've seen throughout my career is there's somewhat of a disconnect with the scientific research and the public. And especially at the university level, you're always fighting to get publications and work towards getting more funding to do more research. But there's not this connection with people and getting the people to understand the research and the importance of it. So the real purpose of starting this nonprofit was try and look for a different way to share the scientific research with the public. And help foster this better connection with people and nature. Because as a conservationist, I believe that the only way forward really for protecting biodiversity and protecting threatened and endangered species is to have people really care about it and have this connection with nature, which has really been lost in our society. We are, like I said, most of our projects are funded with federal grant money. I do want to just say, I feel remiss that I've never really said this to this group or to the people involved with this project. We are not funded to work on this project at all. We have no grant money. We've had some generous donors 2 of the last 3 years that have allowed us to pay for the time for our organization to work on the community science part of this project, but also to do our demographic research, which I'll talk about in the next slide. This year, we actually don't have any funding at all. So we are putting out requests for donations. We are a nonprofit, we do take donations. So if you are able to give and you want to help support this project on our end of what we're doing here at Conservation Insight, please visit our website. You can find out more about us and there's links there for you to donate. But jumping into this project, and if you've seen me talk before, you've probably seen this slide up front. I like to talk about this connection of the larger scientific research study that we have going on at Powell Butte, looking at the demographics of grassland breeding birds and how that ties into these community science surveys, which is what really the purpose of this talk is to present some of the data from the first 3 years on those surveys. What we're going to do in this talk really is jump around between both of these. I want to show how important the community science information is for the demographic research and vice versa. This all gets used together to help inform the land managers up at Powell Butte. The demographic research is very time consuming, and I usually hire field technicians and train them because we have methods that need to, and protocols that need to be followed very strictly to gather the data consistently from year to year. We're trying to look at focal species that are using those meadows up at Powell Butte and see how they're doing now before restoration occurs. And as you all know, there's a large construction project that is ongoing up there, and we're going to talk more about that again in the next couple of slides. But the purpose of that construction, or the end goal of that construction, is to work on the underground reservoirs, but then to actually restore the grassland habitat above to more suitable habitat for all species that require these prairie habitats in the Willamette Valley. I'm working with grassland birds, but there's all kinds of other species that are going to benefit, including plants and insects and anything that historically would have used these prairies, which have largely been lost from the Willamette Valley. I'm not going to talk much about that in this presentation. I've done that in other presentations, but it's important for you to know that about 97% of the historic prairies in the Willamette Valley are gone. And you can just drive down I-5 and you see what it is. It's development and it's farming. So these little remnant patches, like at Powell Butte, are very important for these grassland bird breeding species. A lot of the birds that breed in grasslands are grassland obligate species, and they will not breed anywhere else. The species that we're working with largely up here for our study right now are savannah sparrows. They're the one grassland species that actually can tolerate small patches of grassland and habitats that's not really highly suitable for some of the more obligate species. So that's why we selected them as our focal species. Now we're hoping to continue this research after restoration advances and maybe start working with the more obligate species like western meadowlarks and Oregon vesper sparrows. Those are the much more threatened species that just aren't breeding at Powell Butte yet. The community science surveys, the really important part, the information that you're gathering that's different than what we're doing at Conservation Insight on our demographic research is you're collecting data on the entire bird community at Powell Butte Nature Park, not just the focal grassland species. So as habitat's restored, the grassland birds are not the only ones that are going to benefit. There's going to be plenty of other species that are going to benefit from this. And getting this important count data from the community science surveys gives us some information on the entire bird community up there. And importantly, this feeds back into our demographic study, and it allows community participation in this larger scientific research project. And that's one of my hopes, is that everyone that participates in this is getting something out of it. You're helping us gather information, but I hope you're all learning something too, and feeling like you're a part of this important study, because your efforts really are very important to the overall goals of this research project. So the construction that's going on up there, many of you are aware there's two large underground, I think they're 50 million gallon underground reservoirs. There's an older one, which is Reservoir 1, and there's a newer one, Reservoir 2. They're right next to each other, and I'll show you on a map in a minute exactly where they are on the butte, in case you don't know. You have, if you've participated in these surveys, you've walked by Reservoir 1 many times, either on Pipeline Lane or Reservoir Lane, and you've seen this area of, it's like a mono culture of grass, and that's what this picture is showing, this sunrise picture. It's the grassland on top of Reservoir 1 before they dug it up. This grass is non-native. There's very few native plants on this because at the time that this reservoir was initially put in, back in the mid-'80s, people weren't really thinking about planting native species. The grass is very tall, it's very dense. Most grassland birds are not going to nest in this. I threw up on this slide a picture of a typical grassland bird nest. This is a savannah sparrow nest, but a lot of grassland birds are actually ground nesters, and they require some open space in the habitat to be able to move around, because they spend a lot of time running and foraging on the ground. That nest is literally just a little whorl in the grass at the bottom of the grass. Most grassland birds will not nest in this tall, thick grass. Savannah sparrows actually will. So there are savannah sparrows already breeding on top of Reservoir 1. The construction project that's going on is to repair that underground reservoir. This picture was taken back in February, and it shows the current status of the project. It was dug up. All that grass, that beautiful grass you're seeing in the little picture on the left of the screen now, is gone. The reservoir needed to have some repairs and have some modernization, and it's currently about 75% complete of the major construction. There's waterproofing that's being put on top right now, and that's 75% complete. That will still be getting worked on through this spring. The construction project is dragging into a second year, and that's not a bad thing. I'll talk about that in a minute, why that's not a bad thing. Many of you maybe are worried that this is taking longer than it should, but they're actually, the Water Bureau is actually thinking about birds, and that's why this project is dragging on a little bit. Once the waterproofing is done on the surface, they're going to lay down gravel and put in some drainage pipes and then dump soil back on top of this. This is when it gets really exciting. After the soil is dumped back on, they're going to replant grasses. And the goal going forward is not to have it look like that tall grass monocrop that you see in this picture on the left, but it's to look like this. And you can see the difference. It's much more diverse. This, by the way, this is a picture on the top of Reservoir 2, which was restored on the surface about 5 or 7 years ago. And when this restoration project was done, native grasses were planted, grasses and wildflowers, all these things that are native to the Willamette Valley prairies. And this is really important. If you look at this picture, you can see there's open space in the habitat. So those nests that the ground nesting birds want, where they lay their eggs, where they're going to breed every year, they need that open space. And they like the diversity of plants. The diversity of plants comes with diversity of insects. These are all insect-eating birds, all these grassland birds that are breeding. And many birds, even if they're seed eaters in the winter, they're eating insects and feeding their young insects because the growing young need protein. So diversity of plants leads to diversity of insects, which is good for birds. So this project that we're doing up here, we were very interested in seeing how the grassland birds respond to these restoration actions, because the habitat is going to get better on the Butte as restoration advances. So the grassland bird monitoring study design is twofold, and I'm going to talk about this demographic monitoring first, and then we'll talk about the community science project. And eventually, trust me, we are going to get into some results from the community science project. So if you look at this map, you can see there are 3 what we call demographic study plots, A, B, and C. Our A plot is the one to the top of the map, is directly underneath the 2 reservoirs. Reservoir 1 is the one that has been dug up and is going to be, the construction is going on, is going to be restored this year. Reservoir 2 is the one that has already been restored on top. So the difference right now is that, or the difference in 2019 when we set up the study was that Reservoir 1 had non-native grasses on it and Reservoir 2 had native plants on it. So we've been monitoring the nesting success of birds in these areas to see if it's better in the areas with native plants. And the spoiler is that surprisingly for savannah sparrows, it was not that much better in the native plant areas. The adjacent study plot B, is this area. If you walk around Meadowland Lane, you see another meadow area that has more woody vegetation mixed in with it. So it's not really very highly suitable for grassland birds. They like grass and flowers, and they don't like woody vegetation for a lot of reasons. If you keep going south and you walk around Summit Lane, you see that other area on the Butte of a meadow. And as many of you are probably aware, that has a lot of invasive species. This is where the park does a lot of management of tansy ragwort. Now, again, savannah sparrows are breeding down there, so it's being used, but these less pristine meadows are not attractive to the obligate grassland breeding birds like western meadowlarks. These birds show up at Powell Butte in wintertime in small numbers, and none of them are really sticking around to breed. So the second big part of this project are these community science surveys, which some of you have participated in. Now you can see on this map, there's some colored lines running around our demographic study plots. So this community science surveys were designed so that you all our volunteers, could actually survey for birds in and around our demographic study plots without walking through those study plots. And that way we minimize disturbance to these ground nesting birds. The surveys are done in April through June every year. And we've done this for 3 years, since 2019. And as I said before, we're counting all the birds that are being detected, not just the grassland birds. And that's really important for giving us information on the entire bird community at Powell Butte. So we're going to jump into some results from the demographic study. And what you're seeing here are on our two main demographic study plots are territory maps for savanna sparrows. In 2019, we had 19 breeding pairs on plot A spread out somewhat evenly between the two reservoirs, and another 18 pairs, almost the same amount, on plot B. I didn't show plot C, but there was a similar density of birds down there. Jumping ahead to 2021, it looks really different. Something happened even before the restoration occurred. So this is still before the construction happened on the reservoir. The numbers pretty much doubled in both of these areas. You can see that we now have 35 pairs on A. It's split up evenly between the reservoir 1, the old reservoir, and reservoir 2, the restored reservoir. And then we have 41 male territories on plot B. We didn't do intensive monitoring there, so that's why it looks a little different. The map doesn't really show their territory size properly, because we didn't have the funding to hire enough people last year to collect the data we needed on both these study plots. So we put most of our effort on the plot A. And the reason we did that was we knew they were going to be digging up reservoir 1 at the end of the breeding season. And we wanted to collect as much pre-construction data as we could, so that we can look at the trends in bird numbers, in nest success, and in survivorship before and after that construction project. So I wanted to throw a slide in here before we start talking about some more data. I wanted to share with you how this project has already informed management up through the 2021 season, and it's going to influence the 2022 construction season as well. Our data from our demographic research and from the community science surveys has been shared regularly with Portland Parks, Portland Water Bureau, and recently Portland BES has gotten involved. And the Portland Water Bureau has really been listening to what we've been saying about when birds are breeding, where they're breeding, and the effects that this project could have on them. So the timeline for this project was actually pushed out a little bit last year. And the project was started late. The construction project was started late because the Water Bureau understood that there would have been severe consequences to these savanna sparrows breeding on Reservoir 1. All those territories, those birds were there through the end of June with young. And so the Water Bureau actually held off on starting that construction project to allow those birds to breed for another season, which was great. And going into next year, the Water Bureau is also going to be surveying for birds in the area around the construction project to make sure there are no breeding birds that could be impacted by the continuing construction. And BES is doing those surveys in 2022. They did them in 2021. They're going to continue in 2022. And another important thing that happened based on our discussions with Portland Parks and Portland Water Bureau, we were asked the question, okay, we're going to dig up Reservoir 1. What's going to happen to all those birds? And I said, okay, we don't really know. They need somewhere to go. I said, one of the things you could do is you could go down into that plot B area and you could improve habitat in this year, in 2021, fall of 2020, and improve habitat to the point where you might create more suitable habitat. And Portland Parks did that. They went out and they did a lot of mowing, a lot of woody vegetation removal. They took out hawthorns, they took out blackberries. And if you walked around Powell Butte recently, you may have noticed that that habitat around Meadowland Lane looks different. There's much more wide open meadows now. And we're hoping that that will entice those birds on Reservoir 1 to actually go over there and breed successfully in 2022. Because if we look at the next slide, that red area is the area that is going to be unavailable for breeding for birds in 2022. It's still dug up. The construction project is still going on. And we knew that this was going to happen this year. So we're losing the breeding season for those birds. but it doesn't mean those birds are losing the breeding season. They can go elsewhere to breed. They could go up to Reservoir 2, that area on Plot A. However, that's likely at the carrying capacity. These birds are very territorial. You'll notice that the territories don't overlap by a lot. So there's not a lot of space for more Savannah sparrows to breed over there. So the more likely thing is for them to go to Plot B and breed in that area. Now, that plot actually was near its carrying capacity as well this year. So we're not quite sure if they're going to be able to breed there. However, that habitat management that the Park Service did to open up more habitat may allow those birds to breed there. So this is the big question. Is there enough suitable habitat on Powell Butte for these birds to remain here? Another scenario is these birds could just pick up and leave Powell Butte. They also could fly over down to that Plot C that I haven't been showing you, or to other areas on Powell Butte. And this is where it's going to be pretty interesting for the community science surveys, because as volunteers, you're going to be surveying all these areas outside of our demographic study plots, and you're going to hopefully find Savannah sparrows in new and exciting areas. And I think what will probably happen is the total counts on Powell Butte will remain about the same for Savannah sparrows. There'll be a shift in the habitat usage elsewhere. Or you may go out there and you may count far fewer sparrows, and it would be a good indication that these birds actually left the Powell Butte site entirely. And I should have said this earlier, many birds, including Savannah sparrows, have really strong site fidelity. So these birds are probably going to show up back at Powell Butte and at least think about breeding before they make a decision to leave the butte. So that's another thing that could happen, is because these high counts early in the season and low counts later in the season as birds come and try to breed where they nested last year and then end up leaving. So now we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about the community science data and how it's important for the overall research project. So this is a little bit of statistics here. I'm trying to keep this really simple. We're looking at the data over the last 3-year period, in 2019, 2020, and 2021. So those are the 3 big gray boxes. The colored boxes within there think of it as the average of the counts of Savannah sparrows per survey. So for example, in 2019, that orange bar is on Meadowland Lane, and there's somewhere between 5 and 15 sparrows being counted on average on every survey. You'll notice that, and if you've participated in these surveys before, you probably expect this, that most sparrows are being counted on Reservoir Lane. That's the survey route that runs right through the 2 meadows where most of the Savannah sparrows are breeding. So that is the highest count. So the community science survey data is really, it's tying in nicely with what we're seeing on our Savannah sparrow demographic research. Another interesting thing to look at is looking at the data over 3 years, it's fairly consistent. Now I told you that Savannah sparrows almost doubled on the Butte on our demographic study plots, and you see a slight, if we were to draw a trend line across these 3 years, there is a slight increasing trend in the survey data that you all collected. But it's not as extreme as we saw on the demographic study plots. And this is just a function of the way these surveys are done. It is really, as many of you probably know, it's very challenging to count the number of Savannah sparrows out there when there's a lot of them on the landscape. So I would expect, even though our survey methods picked up double the number of Savannah sparrows on our demographic study plots, I wouldn't expect the community science surveys to count double the amount of sparrows. It just gets too hard to count sparrows when there's more than 5 or 6 or 7 singing at any one time. So the big question now going forward, and actually I'm going to take a drink of water to pause for a second. The really big question is, what are we going to see in 2022? We know this large area on Reservoir 1 is going to be unavailable. And so if you look at our hypothesis A, so this is a graph of the 2021 actual data and the 2022 data under hypothesis A, which says that Savannah sparrows will move to other areas on the Butte. I X'd out Reservoir Lane because we're not going to be doing surveys there. Since the construction is ongoing, we're not going to have permission to do surveys on that route. It's going to be unsafe for us to be out there. So we're not collecting data on that route. But we're going to survey all the other 5 routes. And what I think we'll see happen and hope is that, first of all, on pipeline land, another area where there's usually a lot of savannah sparrows, those numbers are probably going to drop because that area does go around the area that's going to still have construction going on. So birds are probably not going to try to breed there. And what I hope we'll see is that on those other routes, meadowland lane and summit lane, the savannah sparrow numbers are going to go up. So if we do this plot next year with the actual data, we're hoping it looks something like this hypothetical plot. Now, the other thing that, like I mentioned before, is these birds could just up and leave the butte entirely. And if that's the case, we're going to see overall savannah sparrow counts decline across the entire, all the survey routes. So another part of this study that's going to be somewhat new this year, and we're going to talk more about this in the trainings. I'm not going to get into it a lot here, but I wanted to just throw this out there. This is something new that we're going to probably ask volunteers to be doing this year. We want you to watch out for color-banded sparrows. You see a picture here of a savannah sparrow that was actually banded last year with a unique combination of color bands. We do this so that we can track individuals. Otherwise, there's no way we can track. We know when we're watching a bird in the field to collect demographic data like nest success and to map its territory, all those things we need for the demographic study. We need to have color-banded individuals so we can track their movement and track their survivorship over time. The birds get these 4 codes, or 4 bands. One is an aluminum band, which is always one of the lower bands on the leg. And in this study, I tried to always put it on the right leg of the bird. Then they get 3 color bands, and the combination of the placement of those color bands on the legs tells me who this individual is. And you always, when you're looking at birds, again, we'll talk much more about this if you are going to volunteer for the study. We'll talk more about how to get proper resights of these birds. When you're looking at a bird, you have to remember if you're looking straight on like this, you're looking at its right leg, which looks like it's on the left side there. And when you write the bands down to report them to me, you write them left to right always. So this bird is white, red, WHRD, and yellow aluminum, yellow over aluminum. And it's as simple as that. We spent a lot of effort last year color banding the birds on Reservoir 1. We color banded almost all of the males because males are very easy to capture. And we color banded a bunch of females and almost all of the nestlings. So these birds are going to return to Powell Butte this year. And this is what's really interesting. While you're out there counting birds, you're going to get us numbers, count numbers on these birds on other areas of the butte. But if you also find color banded birds for us, you're going to get us actual movement data on individuals and how they responded to this construction project. And that's going to be great scientific information. So let's go into some survey results from the Grassland bird surveys. First of all, we say this over and over again, but really thank you so much to all our volunteers. We couldn't do this without the volunteer surveyors. We hope many of you will come back, and I hope any of you that have not participated will be excited by this talk and maybe want to participate this year. We've had 33 volunteers over the 3 years of this study. 2020 was a challenging year for us. We didn't have many volunteers participate because we did limited surveys on purpose because of the beginning of the pandemic. We started getting back into the swing of things in 2021, and in 2022, we should be back to some sense of normalcy. So we'll probably have, hopefully, a lot of volunteers this year. We'll get more surveys in. We have 140 hours of surveys that were already done over this 3-year period and 124 miles of trail surveyed. This picture shows you actual birds that were have seen and counted on our surveys. Some of them are common birds. Some of them are actual pictures from Powell Butte, some are from the internet. We have, if you can see my cursor, I'll try to show you. We've got savannah sparrows are very common, and as hummingbirds, robins are very common. If you haven't spent a lot of time at Powell Butte, a very common breeder there is lazuli bunting, which is really exciting. They're everywhere up there in the breeding season. We get a lot of them on our counts. Some of the rarer birds, we have yellow-breasted chats are seen regularly at Powell Butte. Bullock's oriole was seen one time. Northern shrikes have shown up on our surveys. Some Eastern Oregon birds like Townsend solitaire and Say's phoebe have shown up. So we have some pretty exciting birds on these surveys. So you never know what you're going to find out there while you're doing it. It's good fun. You're collecting important data for us, but it's just fun to see the birds that are on Powell Butte. It's a fantastic birding site. So the survey data is available, the full data set is available on our website. You can go there and go through our site and find a link to this project and to the community science surveys, and you can actually download these data and look and see exactly what birds were counted there over the 3-year period. The table is showing the species name and the AOU codes. We use AOU codes a lot for graphing because it fits better than species name on the graphs. We have 3 columns with our data by year, and then we have the pool data is the total count data over the 3-year period. So you can see how the counts have changed from year to year. The counts are influenced by the survey effort. You can see in 2019, our first year of surveys, we had many more surveys done. We had more volunteers and more effort put that year. So we counted the double the amount of birds than any other year. Hoping in 2022, our surveys will be closer to 2019 than 2020 or 2021. This number of species detected per year is interesting. There's a somewhat downward trend, but again, our effort was slightly lower. So that's not an alarming trend, but we do want to watch those kinds of trends with this community science survey data. That's one of the great things about these types of data. It can really show trends. We want to know, is there something going on in Powell Butte? Are we seeing lower diversity again? Let's say we see lower diversity in 2022, even with a lot of effort. We need to start asking that question: what's happening on the Butte? Is it that construction project? Is it some type of management that we're not doing or that we could be doing better for habitat? But again, these are not alarming trends right now at all up at Powell Butte. And we may see an increasing trend in birds as restoration advances. That's the ultimate goal. We want to see not only would grassland birds numbers go up, but maybe overall diversity on the Butte is going to go up. And that's what the community science data will show over time. Another way to look at the data is to look at the species detected by survey route. And again, this is up on the website. You can look at this. So you know, if you're going to volunteer, you can see, oh, what kind of birds might I see on meadowland lane, for example. And you'll notice, interestingly, that the total number of species detected on each route is about the same, as is the total number of birds counted. What's different, if you take the time to look at our data online, you'll see that the number of species detected on each route is about the same, but the composition of species is quite different. You're going to see, for example, on Pipeline Lane, which runs along some coniferous trees and some better forest, you're going to start getting more migratory birds in there, like warblers. So that's a fun survey route to be doing during migration. And then what I would do if you're volunteering is try to sign up for different routes and try them all, because it's fun to see the different birds that you'll see on each of these survey routes. Okay, so one chart I wanted to throw up here for you to look at is just for those of you that have volunteered on our surveys. I get asked this a lot by our organizers and our partners, but also by surveyors, the volunteers. Are we doing the surveys at the right time of day? The goal is, our protocol calls for all these surveys to be done by 3 hours after sunrise. Birds are more active in the morning. And these density plots are looking at what we call the sunrise offset. It's the number of minutes past sunrise that a survey was started. The good thing about these charts over the 3-year period is that it's relatively consistent. The bad news is we're starting our surveys a little late, which we knew. The average start time is pushing 2 hours past sunrise. We'd like to see that move a little closer towards 1 hour past sunrise, so people get up there a little earlier. And I just wanted to show this here for any of you that have participated and know the challenges with getting into Powell Butte to do these surveys early. I wanted to just put this in your minds that maybe we can talk about this, about ways we can encourage people or make it easier for people to get out there earlier to do surveys. And when we do the trainings, we'll talk a lot more about this, but we want your input on that if you have ideas on how we can help you to get surveys started a little bit earlier. Okay, the last few slides before we open this up for questions are just to show you some plots of the species that have been seen each year. And again, we have the AOU codes in the bottom on the x-axis. The number of surveys where these have been detected. So these plots are going to show you sort of an idea of the occurrence of these birds. How often are they being detected on our surveys? And that does coincide somewhat with the total counts for the season on the surveys, which I put in parentheses. The red plot are our savanna sparrows. And sure enough, they are the most commonly encountered bird on surveys, and they are the most abundant birds at Powell Butte. And this is because of the survey design. We actually have everybody surveying around the areas where savanna sparrows are breeding. The 10 birds that I highlighted on this are the 10 most commonly encountered species and often the 10 most abundant species at the Butte. You'll notice mallards, though, for example, are detected on a lot of surveys, but were only 13 mallards counted on average on surveys at the Butte, because mallards are flying by often. Maybe there's one flying by and most people can recognize them. Mourning doves are another good example. They're encountered very often, but they're not super abundant on the Butte. And I think that's because most of us can identify a mourning dove by sound, and we're hearing them from far away. So they actually get detected quite often on surveys, but not in big numbers. So jumping ahead to 2020, this looks very similar. The top 10 birds are almost identical. The difference are mallards have dropped off of our top 10, and Steller's jays have jumped up onto our top 10. And they're encountered very regularly and can be fairly abundant on the Butte. And we go to 2021, and much the same. The really commonly occurring birds and abundant birds are still our savanna sparrow, our robins, Anna's hummingbirds, spotted towhee song sparrows, and the one that changed, black-capped chickadees, jumped up and became number 10 for the 10th most common bird at the Butte. The really interesting thing to look at here would be all these little short lines. These are the rare birds. I can't even remember what all of these codes are. I'd have to look up the codes myself to remember what every one of these are. TRES is tree swallows. They're actually not very common up at the Butte at all. So if you want to know the rare birds that we've seen on these surveys, please go to our website, download the data, and take a look through it, and you'll get a really good list and see how often some of these other rarer birds are being seen. So this is going to wrap this up. So we have some time for questions. The surveys are on for this year. I said watch for announcements about signups and trainings. I know Johnson Creek Watershed Council have already sent out these announcements. There will be more. We have the surveys planned. The dates are available on their website. So go to Johnson Creek Watershed Council to find out about how you can help this year. I'm going to try to get something up on our website very soon as well. The data that you're going to collect for us, if you haven't volunteered before, please consider participating. The data that you're going to collect, it really is important. It has already helped inform management decisions at the Butte. It's already helped save birds. And we really hope you'll join us again this year. And once again, I'm just going to throw this out one last time. Please, if you'd like to donate to the demographic study up at Powell Butte, please consider checking that out on our website. And I believe that is it. I want to acknowledge all of our partners, Johnson Creek Watershed Council, for pulling this all together and making this happen. Portland Parks and Recreation and Portland Water Bureau have been really supportive of this project. So thank you again to all of our volunteers. And with that, I will stop sharing and we can take some questions. Get this to stop. There we go. Okay, we are good to go with questions.
Before Gwen, why don't you see if we have some questions?
Nothing very much so far, but we did have a question all the way back from the beginning. Alexander wanted to know about how many years we anticipate conducting surveys into the future.
Well, I would like to continue this as long as we can. It is somewhat dependent on funding. It's somewhat dependent on volunteer involvement. And Daniel, what do you think on your end? How long would you like to see this go on?
I think as long as it's useful, and I think it will be, because long after the hopefully the impacts of the reservoir construction are finished, we're going to want to have additional data because Portland Parks and Recreation is continuing to do restoration up there. They've been doing a long-term effort to get rid of invasive species. And just briefly on the land use history, this was once, for many decades, a grazing site. There was a big cattle operation, and you often see a lot of invasive species brought in there. There's been a lot of changes in the last, 80 years up there, lots of invasive species, but they're slowly getting a handle on it. And it'll be interesting to see what happens then. And then also, Tom, you mentioned that when Reservoir 2 was redone and they finished that project, I believe in 2015, 2016, you said they had planted native grasses. It'll be interesting now with this second reservoir to see what they plant there and see how that impacts. So that should be pretty interesting. Let me pose a question.
Mm-hmm.
So you had mentioned, you showed that picture of the Oregon sunshine, the state plant. The state bird has also been known to take up residence or at least visit during the winter. That, of course, is the western meadowlark. But maybe you could comment on what might be going on with the western meadowlark.
Yeah. So for starters, let me just point out that I went up and did some surveys on Saturday or Sunday last weekend, and there was a western meadowlark singing up there. So please go up there and check out, listen for western meadowlarks on Summit Lane. It's been sighted and heard several times this winter. The problem for western meadowlarks, it seems to be the scale of grasslands. They're what's considered an obligate grassland species. They require a really diverse grassland habitat, diversity in plants. And that diversity is not just in types of plants, but in the structure. They like some high plants and some low plants. They don't like plants to be too tall. And they like large areas. Right now, there's not really, the only really nice looking prairie habitat is over Reservoir 2. It's a very small area on the scale of prairies. The areas where western meadowlarks breed in Oregon are much larger than even the total of Powell Butte. So I think if we got all of the meadows restored to really good looking prairie habitat, we'd have a chance at western meadowlarks breeding there. But I suspect there still may not be enough grassland up there to encourage a large population. But we'll never know unless we keep improving that habitat.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And I think, you alluded to this, but although we see western meadowlarks there before our official surveys start, like in February and March, we don't ever see them during the breeding season, that we're looking at. Yeah,
the community science surveys have not picked them up. Maybe once, I think we picked them up during breeding season, and our intensive surveys on our demographic study plots, we have never had a western meadowlark there during the breeding season.
I have a question. How long after the restoration over Reservoir 2 do we expect to see savannah sparrows coming back and breeding there?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So the goal is to finish this project this spring and get everything planted this summer. So we may actually get some growing this season. That would be the best case scenario. If that occurs, if we get some growth this season, as soon as by next spring, we could have savannah sparrows breeding there. I suspect that we may not get enough of a growing season this year. So next season, we may not see many breed if the grasses haven't had a chance to really grow. But these grasses come back quickly. So even if they're planted late summer or fall, and they don't start growing till next spring, it is still possible we could have savannah sparrows next season. Savannah sparrows, again, they'll use habitat that isn't quite perfect. So if the grasses aren't growing back densely or tall enough, they may still decide to breed there.
We have a question in the Q&A. I'm sorry if I mangle your name. Lisa, I think, asks what the main predator of the savannah sparrow is.
Okay, it's another good question. So, and this goes back to the importance of habitat and habitat structure. Avian predators, hawks, are a big problem for adult birds. This is one of the reasons grassland birds don't like grasslands that have lots of perch points. woody vegetation, tall woody vegetation becomes a perch point for a hawk. And those hawks will sit there and just look out over the landscape and pick off adult birds. There was a sharp-shinned hawk last spring that decided to hang out in the cottonwood tree on Reservoir Lane. And I can't tell you how many savannah sparrows I watched that bird take last year. So it's a problem for these birds. And again, it would be nice if you really want to help grassland birds, get rid of all the trees, remove those predators. Now, for nests, the predators are quite different. Nest predators are often small mammals. Voles can be nest predators. Larger mammals like mink and foxes. Foxes can be really problematic. Coyotes can even be nest predators. Those ground nests are very susceptible to predation by mammalian predators. And this is why we're very careful when we're working with sparrows. We try very hard not to leave a trail to the nests. This is why our demographic field technicians have to be really well trained, because we can't take the chance of attracting those types of predators to the nests. And this is why you shouldn't run your dogs out there, and you shouldn't walk through the meadows during breeding season, if you're wondering why those areas are closed during breeding season.
Alexander has another question asking, I think we've already covered this one, but whether any western meadowlarks have been found breeding up on Powell Butte. Alexander also notes that, yeah, seeing lots of western meadowlarks at the airport, but never breeding, but seen often.
Yeah, it's a very similar situation, and some of the airports do actually have breeding western meadowlarks, but again, most of the airports, to my knowledge, it's the same situation we have at Powell Butte. They'll use the habitat, but it's not quite right to entice them to breed, so they end up leaving and finding better habitat or larger areas of habitat in the Willamette Valley. Ankeny is a great place for breeding grassland birds. If you want to see some of these more obligate grassland birds, go down to Ankeny National Wildlife Refuge in the breeding season.
Matt asks a question about getting access to Powell Butte. Maybe we'll actually bring this up more at the surveyor orientation, but asking about whether the impediment is getting access to the park via the closed gate, and if there's a way to deal with that. Matt notes that they come through the neighborhood trailheads, but that takes quite a lot more time than coming through the gate.
Yeah, that's something we'll definitely talk more about in the trainings, because I am aware that's probably a big issue is with the start time of the surveys, is that long walk getting in.
That's all the questions we have in the chat. Any more last questions? That was a fantastic talk, Tom. That was really great.
Thank you.
To see all that data.
Great. Well, again, Tom, I'd like to also say thank you. It's been great working with you in the last 3 years, and look forward to working with you again this year. Before everybody leaves, just want to give the pitch. On March 22nd, we're going to have a Zoom training. This replicates the classroom training we've done before. We do a classroom training and we do a field training. But of course, since we're just coming off of COVID as a country here, we're going to continue to do the classroom training online. That's going to be March 22nd from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. And Gwen, thank you. Gwen has put in the chat the link for signing up. You do have to sign up in advance. And then later that week, Friday the 25th and Saturday the 26th, will be the field trainings at 7:30 a.m. Should take an hour and a half at the most. And you'll be signing up for one or the other. It's not 2 days of field training. We just recognize that in the past, we found some people like Friday mornings and some people like Saturday mornings. And I see Elizabeth has a question there about bird ID. So this is a good question.
Question and answer. So yeah, there are a couple more questions coming in.
Yeah, so this comes up every year. And, you know, for quality data, it is important that you're able to identify just about all the birds that you'll be able to come in contact with. However, we realize that not everybody feels like they're at that level. So what we do is we we don't want to turn away anyone. What we do is we will pair you with some more knowledgeable birders. So even if you don't quite feel you're at that level, again, please do participate, and come to that Zoom training and see if you think this is for you. Yeah, we'll definitely get you out there. And even if you decide after the virtual training that you don't want to do it, we're definitely going to have one or two sort of actual surveys that I'll be doing, or Gwen will be doing, as kind of a QA/QC for the same week that we're doing other surveys. So that way we can bring you along. I'd like to have everyone who would like to be able to experience what it's like to survey. But you'll learn more at the training on the 22nd, what's involved. We do use the worldwide community science platform eBird for collecting our data. So sounds like we have more questions. Is that right, Gwen?
Yeah, there was another one in the Q&A. Someone that wants to know if we've ever seen weasels up on Powell Butte.
Yes, we've seen weasels, and we suspect they're probably a pretty significant nest predator.
All right, well, we're just about at 6:30. If there are no more questions, I think we will end. So I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for coming. And once again, Tom, thank you. This is going to be an exciting year. So take care, everybody. Get out there and do some birding.